Hi, everybody. Today we're going to talk about another set of history that falls after the Roman Empire. So we have our fall of the Roman Empire, and then we have our Celts in Britain lesson, and this comes after that. This is the third one in that series. And this one is about Christianity coming to Britain and monasteries and the beginning of written history in that area of the world. So we know that as the Roman Empire was ending, one religion, Christianity, started to spread through the Roman Empire. Even the Roman emperor himself became a Christian at that point and told all of his subjects that they should be too. And so that religion spread a lot right before the Roman Empire went down. And then the Roman Empire ended. But at that point, a whole bunch of people had already converted to this new religion. And they had this guy called the Pope who was like in charge of looking after everyone in that religion. And one of the things that the Pope said was that people should take their idea of the religion and go to new places and spread it to new people. And so after the Roman Empire ended and the Celts were living in Britain and they had some of those Angles and Saxons from up north that had come and lived with them too, then some Christian monks started spreading out into that area and setting up monasteries. And the way a monastery works is back then, and sort of still now, but not always the same. Back then, it would be a group of people, normally men, who all agreed that they were going to think about their religion a lot and they were going to all live there together and they were going to work together and make things to meet their basic needs and not get married and not have kids and work on spreading their religion to other people. And so these monasteries were all over the place. And one of the things that happened in these monasteries was writing books, because there was this Roman Empire sort of religion that was spreading up to areas where they didn't have written history before. So remember that in Britain, the Celts and the Angles and the Saxons all used an oral tradition of history. That means they passed down their stories by talking and by singing. They had bards whose jobs it was to memorize all of these songs that told the stories of their lives and go travel around and sing those songs so that everyone would learn their history. Well, when the Christian monks ended up in the area, they were really into the idea of writing down history. And so one of the things they did that was pretty cool was spread the idea of written history up into Britain, which means that once they got there, we start to have books that tell us about how those people were living their lives. And so we can know more to talk about from history. Now, what I want to read you from our book is this little section about how books were made by hand in monasteries back then. Some of us have talked about this in past years, but you'll probably still get a little bit of new information. Even I got a little bit of extra information from reading this section of the book, and I've been telling you the story of writing and creating books in monasteries for like 3 years now. So check this out. All right. A few lessons ago, we learned that the years after the fall of Rome were called the Middle Ages, and that in England they were known as the Dark Ages. Most people in England couldn't read or write and didn't write down their stories and histories during that time. When the monks showed up in England, they taught people how to read and write, as well as trying to spread the idea of their religion around as well. Specifically, they wanted people to be able to read so that they could read the Bible, because they were saying, hey, here is this book that has information about our religion in it. You should read it. But they were handing it to people who didn't know how to read yet, so they had to teach them to read for that to work. Now, the monks that worked in these monasteries also thought that reading and writing was really important. They spent a lot of their day reading the Bible and other books written about religion. But back in the Dark Ages, books were a lot harder to make than they are today. Bookmaking was a really long, really complicated project. And one of the things that the monks in these monasteries would do was make books. In the Dark Ages, you couldn't just go to the store and buy paper. So monks had to make a special type of paper called parchment that was actually made out of animal skin. They'd take cow or sheep skins and put them in running water, like in a stream or a river, and leave them there for several days. And then they'd soak them in a barrel with water and lime. Not lime like the fruit, but lime like the compound that comes from the soil, so a chemical from the soil. And that would loosen all the hairs off of the skin. Then they'd stretch out the skin and scrape all the hair off with a knife and leave it stretched out so it would dry in this big flat sheet. Once that was finally dry, then they'd take it off the frame, get it wet again, and rub it with a stone to make it kind of like softer and smoother so that it would actually let the ink into it. One medieval book tells us that the best way to wet the skin was to take a mouthful of beer and spit the beer all over the skin. So that was one of the ways that they would do that process while they were wetting it and rubbing it with a stone, was to spit beer on it. Seemed like a good idea at the time, and apparently it worked. When the skin had been dried all over again, it was time to make the ink by mixing soot with water and the sap of trees. A monk had to prepare quill pens by pulling feathers out of a goose or a swan's wing, soaking the feathers in water and scraping at the tip. Then the parchment had to be cut into rectangles, folded over to make pages, and stitched together into books. Some of you have done a little bit of stitching together books in our classroom. Imagine if you had to do that for a book this big, and so you stitched all the little sections and then stitched those sections together. It's a really big work. Finally, once they had all of that done, it was time to do the actual writing. All of the books at that time were written by hand. So the monks would work all day in these special rooms called scriptoriums, which means a place for writing. They'd make copies of the Bible and other books that they thought were important by setting one book next to them and just copying it straight into the new book they'd made. Every single letter had to be written in their best handwriting. Now, the books that they copied weren't just, black writing on a white page like this book is. They also would decorate them using really nice, beautiful colors and pretty little designs. One way they would make paint is by mixing the colors in with egg whites to make them extra shiny. And then silver and gold, like actual silver and gold, would be beaten into sheets that were really, really thin, and then stick little bits of those sheets onto the page. So some of these books had actual little tiny scraps of silver and gold in them. Sometimes there would be pages that were just a picture, just like when we read books now. But that picture would have been done very carefully drawn by hand with little bits of gold stuck onto it to make it fancy. Sometimes just the very first letter on a page was fancy. That's called illuminating a page, when you have the first letter all beautiful and fancy pants and then the rest just looks normal. Writing out long books by hand was slow work. An expert monk might copy out 2 to 3 books in a year while working 8 hours a day. Maybe you want to do the math on that. If you work 8 hours a day for 2 years, how many hours have you spent to write just 2 or 3 books? There weren't many books available in the Middle Ages because it was such hard work to make the books. And because the books were so rare, they were super valuable. Sometimes in libraries, books would be chained to the shelf. There would be an actual metal chain that attached the book, so you could only take it a little way away from the shelf to read it. You just have to step back and stand there and read it standing up so that you could still be attached to the chain. You definitely couldn't check out books from the library in this time. Now, monks weren't supposed to talk when they were in the scriptorium because they were supposed to be working hard copying those books. But they still got bored sometimes, just sitting there copying out words from one book to another day after day for 8 hours. And what's really neat is that sometimes when they were bored, they would make little notes or little doodles in these books. And some really old books left from the Middle Ages still have these notes and doodles that the monks did in the side of the books that no one noticed. So there are some that have little notes in them that say things like, "I'm cold. I wish there was a bigger fire in here, but Brother John won't let us." Another one says, "I wish I were finished. I have to go to the bathroom." And a third one drew a little tiny sketch of a mouse and wrote, "Curse that mouse," in their book. It doesn't say why he was mad at the mouse. Maybe it was nibbling on his shoe or nibbled a corner of the book or stole part of its dinner. But there are actual records of these little tiny notes that the monks left in their books. That would be kind of like if someone found your journal thousands of years from now and saw those little doodles that you make in between writing down what you're doing for the day. I think that idea is really interesting, and I would love, love, love to try and find some pictures of some work from the Middle Ages that has those little notes. But I don't know if that exists out there. Maybe they're still kept secret in some really special libraries. You might like to investigate that. Maybe you want to see what it's like to copy out a book. Don't copy the whole book. That's a crazy use of your time. But maybe you want to try and copy out one page in your nicest handwriting. Remember that those monks, if they made a mistake, they'd have to start over. They might be able to scrape the ink off of the piece of parchment since it was, made of animal skin and not just paper. But if they couldn't scrape it away, they'd have to redo the whole page. Think about that. One tiny mistake and you'd have to redo the whole page. And it's in pen, not pencil. So mistakes are pretty easy to make. Getting a book back in the Middle Ages was a huge, huge work. I personally am insanely glad that books can just be printed now. The history of printing might be a story for another day. Some of you have talked to me about that already in past years. For now, find a way to follow up. Have a good day, and I'll see you around. Bye, everyone.